Hey, good morning. It's Dr. Rob Franklin. I am an internal medicine specialist in Fredericksburg, Texas, and one of the co-founders of Full Bucket. We're going to continue our series on the foal. This is episode number 2, where we're actually going to be talking about the foal's first week of life. Now, episode 1, we went over how to prepare for foaling, how to make sure the mare is ready to be foaled, and what to do whenever the foal gets there. That is available on the website and on Facebook as well for you to go back to review that. In this communication, we're going to talk about the first week of life. So once the foal actually arrives, there's going to be some things that we need to know how to take place and what to instigate and also what to watch out for. And the first thing on day 1 is to make sure that you know what sort of vet checks that you're going to need to have accomplished. So that you should have a good relationship with your veterinarian. Your veterinarian should know that you have a mare that is about to foal, and you should make sure that your veterinarian or someone is available in their place if they're out of town to come out to get your foal examined in that first 24 hours. There's a critical period where as veterinarians we want to come out and do a healthy foal check and a mare check, and that's typically between 18 and 24 hours. The reason is that in that period we have what we call passive transfer. That should have taken place. So that first milk drink is called colostrum, and colostrum should have all the antibodies that foal is going to need for the first couple of months of life. And during that 18 to 24 hours, the intestines actually allow that colostrum to be absorbed into the bloodstream. After 18 to 24 hours, that can't take place anymore, and so that foal is going to be predisposed to severe infections if that does not take place. So as veterinarians, we're always going to schedule our foal vet checks no later than 24 hours of age, and as early as 18 hours, and sometimes a few hours earlier, depending on what time the foal was actually born. So you should have a good record on when the foal was born, and as soon as that has taken place within business hours, you don't need to call us at 4 in the morning to schedule your afternoon appointment. But during business hours, you give us a call and get us scheduled on our route to come out to your place and to have the foal inspected. Now, during that time, we're not only going to be looking at the foal, we're also going to give the mare an examination. Mares normally have no problem with foaling, but sometimes they have some very subtle things that can cause major problems. The first is that we'll do an inspection on their reproductive tract to make sure they didn't have any tears or holes during the delivery process. And sometimes the foal's hoof can go through areas and tear areas where we need to do some repair, or we need to soften the mare's diet perhaps to allow easy passing of feces around that bruised area. They can also retain the placenta, so we talked about last time about retaining or preserving that placenta so that we can inspect it and make sure that it's been completely expulsed during that first 3 hours, as we talked about 1, 2, 3 last time, with 1 being the foal should stand in an hour, and 2, it should nurse in 2 hours, and 3, the mare should pass that placenta within 3 hours. So we're going to look at the placenta. We're also going to make sure that her intestines are working okay, that she's got a good appetite, she's not running a fever. They can develop infections. They can actually get a tear not only in the outside of the reproductive tract, but also in the inside, in the uterus. The foal can tear them during the delivery, and that can lead to a problem called peritonitis, or an infection there in the abdominal cavity. So we'll be looking for subtle signs of that. Colic is another thing that some of these mares will develop after foaling. So it's good for us to put our eyes on them. I remember a time during my residency at the University of Florida, we had a very, very sick foal come in into our neonatal intensive care unit, and we had a whole team, what we called the foal team. We just descended on this foal and began to provide life support and emergency sort of procedures for this foal. And about the time we got this foal stabilized, I turned around and looked at the mare, and who was just on the divided part of the stall, and that mare was in a terrible spot. She had severe peritonitis when she walked in, and she was in shock herself. And you know, the mare's stoic nature, you know, she was doing all she could to keep it together, and ultimately, you know, we had to do some emergency services on her as well. So it just, you know, sometimes lightning strikes in two places. So don't forget to put a good set of eyes on your mare, make sure she's good, and as veterinarians, we'll do that as well. So when we look at your foal, we're going to do a complete examination. We're going to make sure that there's no congenital or birth defects. We're going to listen to the heart, the lungs, look at the eyes, check for cleft palates, make sure that the gastrointestinal and the reproductive tracts are fully developed as they should be. We're also going to look at the legs, and sometimes we can get some crooked legs, some weak or contracted tendons that require some special treatments, and so we'll take an assessment there, and we'll also go ahead and provide you with some instructions on what to do following that up. Now we'll also take a blood sample, and sometimes we'll run a blood test right on the farm. The one that you'll always know is going to get run is called an IgG, which stands for an immunoglobulin or antibody G, and then we'll and that's the passive transfer part that we talked about. And then we will also be perhaps looking for other signs of infection. Early indicators of infection could include something called serum amyloid A, which is a stall side test that we can do in the field. We may take a CBC and fibrinogen back to the laboratory for complete blood counts. A lot of our insurance companies, when we do insurance examinations for newborn foals, they want the complete blood count along with that in the IgG. And you know, depending on the risk factors, there may be other tests that your veterinarian wants to perform on the foal. So be prepared for that, and for a little venipuncture or blood draw for the foal. So after we've done that, we may talk about doing plasma therapy. And plasma therapy is where we give the foal a harvested donor plasma, which plasma is the liquid part of blood, the non-cellular part of blood. It does contain immunoglobulins or antibodies, and so a lot of times we will take those antibodies and we'll give those to the foals if they've had failure of passive transfer, where they didn't get the colostrum. Either the mare didn't make it, foal didn't drink it, or it wasn't absorbed. Any of those things can lead to this failure of passive transfer situation that ultimately will lead to infection and death. So we'll give them plasma if they need it. And in some situations, in Texas, Florida in particular, and in Kentucky, where we see problems such as Rhodococcus equi, which is a cause of pneumonia in foals that are anywhere from 4 to 12 weeks of age, we'll give them some plasma from horses that have been vaccinated against that disease and where they have a really high antibody count. And we'll try to get those antibody levels really high, because that infection occurs very early on in life. It doesn't develop into full-blown pneumonia until 4 to 12 weeks of age, but the whole process begins very early on. So we'll sometimes, depending on the risk factors, we'll take plasma and we'll prime their systems with a high dose there. We can also be, again, replacing they didn't absorb the colostrum, so we give them the plasma that has the antibodies intravenously. And so we'll do that right on the first day in many cases. You may have an outbreak of something like diarrhea that's going on at the farm. And in those cases, we may also give them a plasma transfusion in hopes of getting those antibody levels, even in a foal that did absorb colostrum, but getting those antibody levels really high so that they can not be affected with a disease outbreak that may be present. So then, once we've got the foal checked out, the mare's checked out, we've done our plasma, done our blood test, we do want to go ahead and get that foal exercising. We talked that last time that exercise is good. Now you do want to look at your environment and make sure that you've got a safe place, good fences, that the external environment in terms of the weather, that we're not challenging the foal with severe weather. That's normally pretty intuitive. The other thing you want to think about, though, is what sort of what types of animals are we turning the foal out with? You don't want to turn a mare and foal out with a band of geldings, or even sometimes brood mares that haven't foaled yet. Those animals can be very curious about the foal, and they can chase the foal around, and what you'll see is that foal will actually get exhausted. It won't have the normal sequence of events where it runs and plays and drinks and sleeps, and you'll actually wear that foal out, and it can cause some serious problems. So don't turn a newborn foal and a mare, and even an older foal and mare, out with a random group of horses. That's not ideal. They either need to go out by themselves, or they need to go out with a similar age-matched band of brood mares and foals, depending on what your environment is. And also pen size. You know, if you're keeping them up at night, perhaps, or in Florida where we typically keep them up during the day because it's so hot, and turn them out at night. You know, if you're doing that, you typically will have groups that you'll put them out with, and that's ideal. And then the size of the pen, you don't want to put them out in such a big pen that, again, they're going to end up in the back of the pen where you're not going to be able to observe them, or that there could be a neighbor's horse that's going to harass them if it's in a really small pen, that is going to chase them up and down the fence line. So use your veterinarian as a resource if you don't have the experience to know what's the appropriate size of pen. Who in my herd would it be appropriate for them to be turned out with? The days 2 through 7 are typically non-eventful in a normal foal. They're going to spend a lot of time sleeping, but when they wake up from that sleep, they're going to play around, and they're going to drink, and they're going to pass a lot of clear urine that indicates they're staying hydrated. But there shouldn't be anything dynamic happening with that foal. It's just going to be gaining about 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds a day, so they really put on some weight. And it should be getting stronger and becoming more inquisitive about its surroundings and about the people in its surroundings and the other animals. And so it's quite a nice time when you're dealing with healthy foals in that first week. Now, we do need to know in the back of our head that this is actually the most vulnerable period of the foal's life. The first week is where we see most of our problems when we're talking about losing foals, because they can get very, very sick, and their bodies just don't have any bandwidth to absorb that illness, and so they succumb to it very quickly. And so we have to really keep our eyes peeled through the use of just frequent checks, or having hired hands that really provide those sort of eyes and ears for you to make sure that things are going well. We talked about with Full Bucket that we do have a sort of a product line that is developed especially for this first week of life, and that's our Foal Kit. We talked about last time that the Foal Kick Start has got a high dose of antibodies that we go ahead and give them orally at the time of birth, and so we can line their entire intestine tract with antibodies so that those will bind any of the disease-causing organisms that they might encounter on that first day. And then we give them the full probiotic, and we give that twice a day, half a tube twice a day. And what that does is it continues to give a smaller dose of the antibodies, but it also provides a couple of strains of very beneficial microorganisms or probiotics. And prebiotics, which are essentially the fertilizer that allow the normal microorganisms to grow in the intestinal tract, and the probiotics, which fend off the bad organisms and allow the expansion of the normal organisms. Remember that a foal's digestive tract, just like a baby, human baby, is born with no microorganisms. And so it's essentially a petri dish, which is something that is designed to host microorganisms, but it hasn't been populated yet. And so they're going to use their environment to populate their intestinal tracts. And hopefully the environment doesn't contain a lot of aggressive microorganisms, things like bacteria like Salmonella or Clostridium, or viruses such as rotavirus or coronavirus. Those things, whenever they enter the intestinal tract, and there's no defense mechanisms there, then they can set up shop very quickly and cause pretty severe disease. So we go ahead and we have those probiotics that fight those things off, the prebiotics that allow for the natural expansion, and then the provision of the antibodies that help intercept things. And then we give them some enzymes that help them break down their milk as well. And so we do that during the first week in hopes of, again, with all the other steps we've taken, we're trying to get that baby through that first week of life without having any major problems. Typically, if everything has gone well, what you'll see is somewhere between 6 and 12 days of age, you'll see what we call foal heat diarrhea. And foal heat diarrhea is not a disease process in so much as that there's a disease-causing microorganism at play. What this typically is just that normal intestinal tract developing the microflora, developing a digestive process, allowing some fermentation to take place. And so you get an environmental change there in that intestinal tract that can cause some loose manure. Typically it's very self-limiting. It lasts for 1 to 3 days. The foal's attitude is always bright. It's nursing well. And it's plain. There's been absolutely no setbacks with that foal. It's just got a little bit of a messy tail back there. The diarrhea is typically not large volume, and it's typically not real watery. So any of those things that are happening that I described are not happening, those would be cause for more alarm. But typically we're looking at that 6 to 12 day mark where we just have a little bit of a wet tail, but we've got a very bright foal that's temperature is normal. Normal temperature for a foal is up to 102 degrees. Now remember, if they're outside on one of these warm spring days and you bring them back in, you stick the thermometer in there, they could have a higher temperature, but at rest in the shade their temperature should be no higher than 102. And that 102 benchmark really starts to adopt a more normal temperature of an adult horse, which is up to 101 at the highest. They start to transition to there about 3 or 4 months of age, and then they should be back at 101 at the highest, but normally somewhere between 100 and 101. As a foal, they're going to be in there between 101 and 102. So we're making sure that any wet tail that we see is just foal heat diarrhea. And the reason we call it foal heat is because typically that mare will come back into estrus or back into breeding reception at about a week after she's given foal, or she's given birth. And then she will be able to go back to the stallion and be bred or bred artificially. That can be a fertile period for some mares. Some mares we elect to let them go through their foal heat because the uterus is still sort of cleaning itself up from the foaling process, and so we choose not to breed. But anyways, it's the timing of that loose manure to the mare's breeding cycle that the reason that we call it a foal heat diarrhea, because they typically both happen at the same time. Now the foal should clean itself up. You can treat the foal symptomatically with the anti-diarrhea drench that we have that has both a probiotic and also a substance to help remove any toxins and tighten them up a little bit, and some electrolytes to help keep them hydrated. Pepto-Bismol, a couple of ounces of Pepto-Bismol works fine in that situation as well. So those are really what we call palliative treatments. They're just taking care of the symptoms. There's no root cause there for us to address, and that's typical. But do check in if any of those things are occurring that shouldn't be, where the foal, it looks depressed, it's not nursing, it's got a fever. Even if it's that day 6 to 12, if they have diarrhea, that you need to be concerned if it has some of those other problems. Other signs that maybe the foal is not normal is that you really need to be dialed into, not just that 6 to 12 days, but really that 1 to 7 days where that critical first week is. You got to know what's normal, and then we're going to look for things that may be outside the picture. So again, the normal thing is that foals like to sleep, and they like to sleep a lot. Remember, they're gaining 1.5 pounds to 2 pounds a day, and so that they've got to do a lot of growing during that period, and that's going to happen while they're sleeping. So they should sleep, but whenever they sleep, they should be roused very easily. So if you go in there, you make a noise, whatever, they should just hop right up and go up. They typically will have a bit of a stretch. They'll urinate. They'll typically whenever they do urinate, remember you should see lots of clear urine being passed, which would indicate they're staying hydrated. And then they should have a suck from the mare, and then they'll play for a little bit, and then they'll go back to sleep. And so that's the normal process. Sometimes you'll see foals that are standing up, sleeping. Normally that's not a normal foal. Sometimes if they're very tired and they just can't find because the mare's keeping them on the run because there's too much stimulus in their environment, then they may do that. But normally that is not a normal sign. So any foal who's sleeping standing up, we should have a closer look at. The old barometers, like a donkey, their ears, when they get flat, that's not a good sign. That indicates something's going on. If you see, especially early on in life, if you see a foal that's straining to urinate or defecate, that could indicate that we have a problem there as well. Now, normally clients will call and they'll indicate the foal's having difficulty urinating. 99% of the time it's actually difficulty defecating or passing feces, and normally that's in that first day or two of life where they're passing their meconium. Now remember, during when they're in the mare, they are having cellular debris, solid waste that they aren't passing. The urinary waste, the fluid waste, they're passing that right from their bladder. It mixes back with blood that goes to the mare, and the mare cleans that out for them. But their solid waste are being compacted into these feces that are called meconium, and they look like black tarry stool. And horsemen are very comfortable knowing what those look like when they're being passed, and they're typically going to be passed in a fairly large pile. And that colostrum meal has a bit of a laxative effect to it to help them pass that. And so it should be passed in the first few hours of life. Now sometimes they can pass some, and they can get one of those balls hung up, and it can cause them to have difficulty, and they can colic. So with that colic, it can range from just mild straining to defecate. They're somewhat constipated too. They can gas up. They can get very, very painful, and rarely we even have to take them to surgery to operate on that. But a meconium impaction is a very common problem for foals, and that is where they get constipated from this hard tarry stool called meconium that they develop whenever they're in the mare. And so we should look to see if they're straining to defecate. We should check in, have they passed the meconium? A lot of times you can give the over-the-counter fleet enemas purchased at the drugstore or the grocery store. Those can help soften that up. There's also some foal enemas that your veterinarian may brew up and administer those. Sometimes we give them IV fluids and some things to help get that passed on, and some pain relievers. And typically we don't have any problem getting those foals through it. Sometimes they have to spend the night in the clinic, but normally we get those foals through the meconium impaction. It's the straining to urinate that's uncommon. There is a problem where foals can have an injury to their bladder, and this occurs more commonly in colts than it does in fillies. But whenever they're being passed through the birthing canal, sometimes if there's a lot of pressure and their bladder's full, that they can actually get a rupture to the bladder. And interestingly, those foals don't typically strain to urinate because they don't have any sensation that the bladder is actually full. Right, the bladder is deflated, and the urine is just entering the abdominal cavity instead of being retained in that bladder. And those foals do require specialized hospitalization whenever you have a ruptured bladder. Again, the sign of that is not so much them straining to urinate, but it's them failing to pass urine and them beginning to get a bloated appearing abdomen or belly. And that's normally the thing that tells us that we've got a problem there. So we want to make sure they're urinating, defecating okay. The normal foal sort of milk feces are kind of tan, pasty in color. In they're going to pass that. They're going to have that on their tail. It'll be in their environment. You normally don't have any trouble seeing that. It's the real watery stuff that we want to be concerned about. And when they get scalding on their backside, that normally indicates there's a problem. There's a lot of acid in the feces that's scalding them, and that's typically associated with a problem, not just a benign case of foal heat scours. Another thing that can be very important to recognize early on is lameness. And I hear a lot of people say, oh, that foal, he hops up and he's lame, but he walks out of it, and maybe the mare just stepped on him. Well, maybe so, but in my experience, mares stepping on foals, that doesn't occur very often. And if you watch even a big old 1,400-pound thoroughbred mare, she walks just is conscientious about where every hoof is landing when her foal's on the ground. They're amazing. They know to avoid those long spindly legs that are stuck in that straw. But instead, you need to be concerned that there could be an infection going on. And the old horseman's term for this is joint ill or navel ill. And what can happen is they can actually get bacteria in their bloodstream that can circulate throughout their body, and the blood is going at high velocity, and then as it gets down to a joint, the velocity slows down, and that bacteria can actually enter into that joint through the capillaries. It can cause a very severe infection that requires aggressive antibiotic treatment and oftentimes hospitalization, where we'll flush the joint. Sometimes we have to use arthroscopy to remove fibrinous debris from the joint, and even do things like regional limb perfusions, where we apply antibiotics in a concentrated fashion just in that particular area that's infected. So those are big deals and not to be missed, because if you just say, oh, maybe the foal got stepped on, and you wait for a day or two before you get that assessed, that can very quickly turn into a situation that's going to potentially result in long-term arthritis. Potentially that can turn into multiple joints getting infected, bone getting infected, and ultimately we can lose the foal, or the foal may have a decreased athletic performance. So lameness or joint swelling, either one of those things, you need to call your veterinarian right away and have them come out and inspect that. Now, coughing is not a common problem in foals, especially younger foals. As they get older, they do. In our next sequence, we'll talk about some of the older foal diseases, but respiratory problems are typically problems of older foals, where we think of gastrointestinal or diarrhea problems being problems of younger foals. But if you do hear a cough in a foal, that's not normal, and that should be investigated. One cough, everyone gets the benefit of the doubt. But if you're seeing something that is frequent, where the foal is coughing or having a nasal discharge of any sort, whether it be milk coming out there, green substances, which would be something like bile, where it's coming up, a reflux is coming up from their intestine, or mucus, which would indicate more of a traditional type of respiratory infection. Any of those things should be tips for you to call your veterinarian and have your veterinarian come out and examine the respiratory tract of the foal. Remember that in about the first week, the baby's going to break its two incisors, and so you'll see that those incisors will come in at 8 days, and then the next one's, we get the 8 days, 8 weeks, 8 months situation where those teeth are erupted. But you should see those start to come out, so they may see a little bit of a raw spot developing there where their incisors are breaking through on that during that first week of life. But that should give you a good indication of what's normal, some things to watch out for that are not normal. And so hopefully you get over this critical first week of life that is such a fun time to hang out and watch foals when things are going great. But it's also a time where, as veterinarians, we really have to earn our keep because these foals just become critical so fast, and our life-saving efforts can be difficult under those circumstances. So an ounce of prevention, a pound of cure, you know the story. Be proactive, be in communication with your veterinarian. Don't cut any corners in terms of trying to save a little bit and hoping something sorts itself out. These problems go from bad to worse really quick. So don't play around during that first week, and I hope that your foaling season goes well for you. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to us via email at info@fullbuckethealth.com. You can post comments here on Facebook, and we'll be happy to reply to those as well. Thanks to Mike Ziegler and Dr. Raf Borges, my good Puerto Rican veterinary friend, for joining us in this live broadcast, and those of you that will watch it down the road. We look forward to hearing from you. Thanks so much, and don't forget to be good and do good in all the things you do.